Sirens cut through the afternoon silence in Newark, echoing through the narrow streets like an impossible-to-ignore warning. The blue and red lights reflected off windows, traffic signs, and even puddles on the asphalt, transforming the landscape into a scene of urgency. Beside an empty field, a white van was surrounded by patrol cars. Police officers ran in different directions, some with flashlights, others with guns drawn, while the public crowded behind the yellow tape, searching for answers. On the ground, just a few meters from the vehicle door, a child's backpack stood out. To the curious, it might have seemed like a forgotten object. To investigators, however, it was a sign that something terrible had happened. The weight of the scene hung in the air, as dense as the roar of the helicopters circling overhead and the news cameras broadcasting everything in real time. And it was in this suffocating scenario that the truth began to emerge. None of it would have come to light without the quiet courage of a 12-year-old boy. He wasn't a police officer, he wasn't a trained hero, he was just an ordinary kid who decided to act when everyone else chose to doubt. But what could drive someone so young to face a danger that even adults would rather ignore? What did he see that no one else could understand? The answers weren't in that van, nor in the sound of the sirens. They were hidden days before, in details too small for the uninformed eye, but which would change everything when they finally came to light, and that's precisely where the real story begins. If you want to follow how this story unfolds, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because what comes next is even more revealing. His name was Jamal Carter, a 12-year-old boy growing up between the busy streets of Newark and the simple comfort of a small apartment he shared with his mother and younger sister. His life was unremarkable to others. He would wake up early, pack his weather-beaten blue backpack, and head to the public school just a few blocks from home. But behind this ordinary routine, Jamal carried a watchful eye and a sensitivity unusual for his age, as if every detail of the world around him were a puzzle needing to be deciphered. His mother, a nurse at a local hospital, worked grueling shifts to support the family, leaving Jamal to take on small responsibilities at home. He cared for his sister, helped with her homework, and, when he could, made simple sandwiches to ensure she never went to bed hungry. This early sense of responsibility shaped his personality, giving him a maturity that contrasted with the childhood he should have been living. At school, Jamal was seen as the quiet kid in the back of the class, the one who rarely raised his hand to answer a question, but who observed everything silently, recording every gesture, every word, every expression. Some classmates mocked his shyness, others simply ignored him, but he never let it get him down. He knew there were more important things than being popular. He harbored a quiet strength within himself, something that would only be revealed when life tested his courage. Despite being reserved, Jamal had a friend who was like an extension of his own family, Maya Robinson, 11 years old, full of energy, always smiling and curious about everything. She was his opposite in almost every way. She talked non-stop, loved socializing, and had an infectious confidence. Still, their friendship was strong, forged in the school hallways, during impromptu games in the park, and in conversations that extended the walk home. Maya saw Jamal as someone she could trust, and he, in turn, felt responsible for protecting her, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. The days seemed to repeat themselves in a predictable cycle: the rush to catch up, the long hours of class, the noisy recess, the return home with books weighing down your shoulders. Nothing seemed to deviate from the routine until an unexpected detail began to catch your attention. Something small, almost imperceptible, but which awakened in you a sense of alertness you couldn't ignore. It was as if, amidst the monotony, a peace had been shifted, a whisper that something was wrong around him. Jamal couldn't explain it, he had no proof, but he felt it, and when he felt it, he was rarely wrong. Little did he know that this instinct would be the starting point for events that would change not only his life, but the fate of an entire community. What seemed like a mere oddity in his routine was about to turn into a living nightmare. And it was precisely at that moment, when the signs began to manifest themselves more and more clearly, that Jamal realized that he could no longer ignore what was happening around him. That week, the air felt heavier around Jamal's school. Dry leaves rustled on the ground in the cold wind, and the distant sound of car horns mingled with the din of children running out as soon as the bell rang. It was in this seemingly ordinary scene that Jamal's watchful eyes caught something no one else seemed to notice. A white van parked near the side gate, almost always at the same time, with its front windows partially rolled down. The driver, a gruff-looking man, sat silently, watching the children move about with a disturbing calm. There was no company logo, no detail to justify his daily presence there. Most of the students hurried past without noticing, concerned only with their rush to get home. But Jamal, unlike them, carried within him a restlessness he couldn't silence. On the first day, he tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was a father waiting for his son, maybe a worker taking a few minutes to rest before continuing his journey. But on the second day, the same van was there, and on the third, too. The feeling that something was wrong grew, like a shadow that lengthened with each sunset. He watched silently as Maya, smiling as ever, passed close to the vehicle, unaware of the danger lurking within. Jamal could feel his heart racing, as if his body were trying to warn her, but his words stuck in his throat. It was difficult for him to explain because he had no proof, only intuition. What gave him the most chills was the way the driver's eyes followed each child as he passed, lingering longer than usual, as if evaluating, measuring, and choosing. That calculating expression stuck in his memory, and it began to haunt him. In his dreams, at night, Jamal would wake up sweating, imagining what would happen if someone got into that van. The boy tried to share his concern with a classmate, but received only laughter in response. "You watch too many movies," they said. This dismissiveness only deepened the loneliness he already felt, reinforcing the idea that only he could see what was happening. Still, Jamal didn't move away. On the contrary, his steps slowed as he left the school, his attention sharpened. Every detail was observed. The sound of the engine idling, the smell of fuel in the air, the vehicle's discreet position to avoid attracting adult attention. The more he looked, the more certain he became that it wasn't a mere coincidence. He didn't know it yet, but this silent realization would be just the beginning of a chain of discoveries that would reveal a danger far greater than he could have imagined. And soon, what seemed like a hunch would begin to materialize before his eyes, proving that his instinct had been right all along. On a gray afternoon, when the sky seemed to be bearing the weight of imminent rain, Jamal decided to summon up the courage and approach the van that had been bothering him so much. The school gate was still full of children saying goodbye, but he, pretending to tie his shoelaces, let the others go ahead and stayed behind. With cautious steps, he walked to the vehicle parked a few meters from the sidewalk. The engine was off, and the driver's figure was nowhere to be seen, as if he had momentarily disappeared. This absence, rather than reassuring him, aroused even greater curiosity. It was then that, for the first time, Jamal noticed a disturbing detail. The van had no rear license plates. Just an empty, dust-covered space where the vehicle identification should have been. The boy's heart raced, and his throat instantly went dry. It wasn't just a feeling. There was something concrete, something real before his eyes. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching him and, on impulse, peered out the side window. The glass was fogged, but enough to reveal what was inside: hastily coiled ropes, rusty chains, and a metal box with heavy locks. Jamal immediately recoiled, his stomach churning as if he'd swallowed a stone. This interior was nothing like that of a family car or a worker's car. It was a cold scene, silently screaming danger. His mind began to race. Was he exaggerating? Could there be an innocent explanation for this? Part of him wanted to believe so, but instinct told him otherwise. Memories of the way the driver had watched the children surfaced, and suddenly everything seemed to make sense. The sound of heavy footsteps made him turn quickly. The driver was returning, his gaze suspicious and his posture rigid. Jamal took a step back, trying to hide it, pretending he was just passing by. But that piercing gaze remained fixed on him, as if the man had read his thoughts and realized he'd been discovered. The boy hurried away without looking back, but certain that the danger was real. That night, as he lay in bed, the boy relived every detail of what he had seen. The void where the plates should have been, the ropes, the chains, everything hammered in his mind like an enigma impossible to ignore. He knew that from that moment on, he could no longer remain silent. The problem was that revealing this would be more difficult than he imagined, because not everyone was willing to believe a boy of only 12. And so, as fear grew in his chest, an even greater doubt began to arise. What would happen when he tried to tell the truth? The next morning, still shaken by what he had witnessed inside the van, Jamal summoned the courage to share what he had seen. He entered the classroom with his heart racing, but with the firm intention of telling his teacher everything, believing that finally an adult would give what was happening the attention it deserved. He waited for the right moment, and when the teacher approached his desk to collect his homework, he spoke quietly, trying to sound confident. He described the vehicle, mentioned the lack of license plates, the ropes, the chains, everything he had seen with his own eyes. The response, however, was a forced smile, followed by a quick explanation that the boy had probably gotten confused, that it could have just been some worker's equipment or moving equipment. Jamal's heart sank. He didn't give up. During recess, he tried to speak to the traffic police officer who usually stood near the school, helping students cross the street. He explained that the van appeared every day, described the driver, and insisted that it wasn't normal. The distracted officer simply gave a short laugh and replied that if it were something truly dangerous, it would have already been detected by city cameras. To him, it was just the imagination of an impressionable child. This indifference was like a door closing on the boy. When he tried to share his concern with some classmates, the reaction was even more cruel. Mockery, laughter, and even snide comments that he was making up stories to get attention. Maya, his closest friend, tried to defend him, but even she seemed to doubt some of what he said. "Maybe you overreacted, Jamal," she murmured hesitantly. That night, at home, he summoned all the courage to speak to his mother. Sitting at the table, while she ate hurriedly before another shift at the hospital, Jamal recounted in detail what he had seen. He hoped that at least there he would be heard. But his mother's exhaustion spoke louder. She sighed deeply, said he was too worried, and asked him not to let fear get the better of him. "You need to focus on your studies, my son. These things are not our problem." These words were spoken without ill intent, but they fell upon Jamal like a sentence of loneliness. The weight of not being believed grew within him. With each denial, each look of contempt or mockery, the feeling of helplessness grew. It was as if he were shouting in the middle of a crowd and no one heard his voice. However, instead of giving up, that frustration began to transform into something else, a silent, almost stubborn determination to prove himself right. And while everyone went about their daily lives, believing nothing out of the ordinary was happening, Jamal decided he couldn't wait for anyone's help any longer. If they wouldn't listen, he'd have to find the answers himself. But how far would a 12-year-old boy be able to go alone when faced with a danger that not even adults dared to see? That night, lying in his bed with the wind blowing against his bedroom window, Jamal couldn't sleep. His mother's and teacher's words echoed in his mind, along with the laughter of his classmates. Everyone saw him as an impressionable boy, someone who fantasized too much. But he knew what he had seen, and even more, he felt deep within himself that the danger could not be ignored. It was in this nighttime silence that a decision took shape. If no one believed him, then he would have to act on his own. The next day, Jamal left home earlier than usual. In his backpack, besides his notebooks, he packed a small notebook and a pen, as if he were about to become a real investigator. Every detail of the van's routine would be recorded, every movement of the driver noted. He wouldn't miss a thing. When he arrived at school, he feigned disinterest, but his eyes were alert, like those of a patient hunter. When the exit signal rang, he positioned himself at a strategic point, near a tree that provided cover. The vehicle appeared just as it had in previous days, parked near the side gate. This time, the driver seemed even more restless, fiddling with his cell phone, looking around as if waiting for the right moment to act. Jamal noted the time, described the man's position, and even his gestures. In the following days, he repeated this ritual. He created a mental map of the vans. Routine, arrival times, the days he stayed the longest, the children who came over. He wrote everything down with the meticulousness of someone who knew that at any moment he might find definitive proof that he was right. The most tense moment came on a Friday, when the school gates opened and Maya, distracted, walked toward the side street. The van driver, smiling forcefully, leaned out the window and waved at her, beckoning with a seemingly innocent gesture. Jamal's heart raced. Without a second thought, he ran to his friend, pulling her tightly by the arm, preventing her from taking another step toward the vehicle. Maya was startled, not understanding his reaction, but within seconds what had seemed like an exaggeration became clear. Upon noticing Jamal's intervention, the driver rolled up the window and accelerated sharply, disappearing around the corner at high speed. The sound of the engine echoed like a threat hanging in the air. Maya's gaze filled with confusion, but also fear. For the first time, she realized that maybe her friend wasn't making this up. Jamal, breathless, tried to explain what he'd seen inside the van days before. And although Maya was still in shock, something in her expression showed she was beginning to believe him. That night, as he wrote in his notebook, Jamal reflected on how close he had come to losing his friend. Now it wasn't just about tests or suspicions, there was a real, imminent risk that could affect any child at school. What if he hadn't run when he did? What would have happened to Maya? Doubt weighed heavily on his mind, but it also gave him greater conviction. He'd been right all along, and the driver's escape was proof there was something to hide. Except he still had no idea how deep the shadowy network was behind that white vehicle. And when he finally began to put the pieces of that puzzle together, he realized that the truth that was about to emerge was much darker than he could bear. The following days seemed to drag by slowly and agonizingly for Jamal. After the van's sped-off incident, he knew he'd touched something too dangerous to simply forget. The notebook, previously filled with random observations, now took shape like a veritable dossier. Precise schedules, detailed descriptions, quick sketches of the symbol he'd seen on the rear window as the car disappeared around the corner. Each page was like a piece of a dark puzzle that only he was trying to piece together. It was during a quick search in the school library among old newspapers no one read anymore, that Jamal made the connection that would change everything. Leafing through a yellowed 2-year-old edition, he came across an article about the disappearance of 3 children in a neighboring town. The detail that made him catch his breath was the description of a graffiti symbol found near one of the scenes, the same drawing he'd seen on the van's window. His eyes widened, and for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't imagination. This symbol, a circle intersected by jagged lines, seemed banal to the uninitiated, but now it took on a sinister weight. Jamal copied the drawing into his notebook, compared it with his memory of what he had seen, and realized they were identical. It was as if a previously buried secret had surfaced before his eyes. However, this discovery sent a chill down my spine. If the same mark was linked to past disappearances, it meant the driver wasn't just a suspicious stranger, but part of something larger, a network that had likely been operating for years without being dismantled. Maya, still frightened by the van incident, began to listen more closely to what Jamal was saying. He showed her the clippings, the notes, the symbols. Although she still struggled with disbelief, it was impossible to deny the frightening logic behind the information her friend had gathered. With each page Jamal turned, she felt the same sense of terror growing within her. What if it was all real? The truth was beginning to assert itself like an inescapable presence. Jamal was no longer just the shy boy who made up stories. He was transforming before Maya's eyes into someone carrying a tremendous responsibility. Yet, deep down, he was just a child, struggling to cope with a burden no adult could bear. At night, alone in his room, Jamal stared at his notebook full of notes and couldn't help but wonder if they'd taken children before, what would stop them from doing it again? The thought made him shiver. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance, as if the driver or someone in that network knew exactly how much he'd already uncovered. And it was precisely in this climate of growing fear that something unexpected happened. A shadow began to loom too close to Jamal's life, proving that it wouldn't be so simple to continue investigating in silence. Because, if until then he had only found clues, now danger was about to knock directly on his door. Nights in Newark were never silent, but for Jamal, the sounds of the city had become a constant reminder that something was watching him. Sirens in the distance, hurried footsteps on the sidewalks, the sound of cars speeding past. Everything seemed more intense, closer, as if each noise concealed a threat. After connecting the van symbol to past disappearances, the boy felt he was no longer just investigating. Now he was part of a dangerous game. That week, he began to notice details that put him on alert. As he left school, he felt like he was being followed. He'd look back and see a man standing on the corner, pretending to read a newspaper, but with his eyes fixed too intently on him. Another time, as he walked home, he heard footsteps behind him that matched his own. When he sped up, the footsteps sped up too. When they slowed down, the sound dragged like a persistent shadow. Turning suddenly, he found only an empty street, but the feeling of being pursued wouldn't leave him. Jamal tried to ignore it, but fear began to eat away at his courage. At dinner, he looked at his mother and wanted to tell her, but he remembered how she had reacted before. He no longer wanted to be seen as a scared kid making things up. He decided to remain silent, but anxiety built inside him like a storm about to explode. On the third night in a row with that feeling, something finally happened. As he walked down the dimly lit street back home, he noticed a dark car slowing behind him. The window slowly rolled down, and for an instant Jamal saw the outline of the van driver. The same cold gaze, the same calculating expression. A shiver ran down his spine. Without thinking, he ran as fast as he could, turning corners, trying to lose the vehicle. He only stopped when he reached his front door, which he hurriedly entered, locking all the locks. That night he couldn't sleep. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he clutched his notebook to his chest, as if it were his only weapon against this invisible enemy. Fear mingled with certainty. They knew he was investigating. The silence of the early morning seemed to scream, and every shadow cast by the moon on the wall seemed to come to life. The next day, Maya noticed her friend's tired look and reddened eyes. He whispered that he believed he was being followed. Maya, now convinced that something sinister was happening, hugged him and told him they could no longer be alone in this fight. For the first time, Jamal felt he wasn't. Completely isolated. Still, the shadow of danger loomed larger than ever, because if before he was just observing a suspicious van, now he was the target of a dark network that made a point of silencing anyone who dared to get too close to the truth. And it would be precisely this increasingly tight siege that would finally lead the police to see what was right in front of everyone. But the public revelation that was about to happen wouldn't just be shocking. It would forever change the way that community viewed its own safety. That Monday morning, the tension that had been simmering for days finally boiled over. Maya, still reeling from recent events, decided to take action that would change the course of history. Instead of remaining silent as before, she told the school principal everything. She recounted the van incident, how the driver had tried to lure her, and how Jamal had stopped her. This time, the words weren't trapped in a notebook or a child's imagination. They were spoken, aloud before an adult authority figure, with details that seemed impossible to ignore. The principal, initially skeptical, noticed Maya's nervousness and Jamal's firm gaze as he confirmed the story. Perhaps it was the tone of his voice, laden with a conviction unbecoming of his age, or perhaps it was the coincidence of similar reports in neighboring neighborhoods. The fact is, for the first time, someone decided to take what these children had to say seriously. The police were called, and within hours, patrol cars were circling the area, searching for the vehicle described. When the police finally located the van on a secluded street, the scene was chilling. The vehicle was abandoned, its windows broken and its doors wide open, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry. Inside, they found traces that confirmed every detail Jamal had described. Chains, ropes, scraps of children's clothing, and above all, a symbol painted in red paint, identical to the one he had recorded in his notebook. It was the missing piece of evidence. The news spread quickly throughout the city. Soon, television stations arrived on the scene, broadcasting live footage. Reporters spoke in grave tones about the suspicion of a criminal network focused on kidnapping children. Parents wept in front of the cameras, residents demanded justice, and the feeling on the streets was one of disbelief. How could something so dark be happening before everyone's eyes without anyone noticing? For Jamal, that moment was bittersweet. The authorities finally believed him, but the price had been high. Days of fear, isolation, and the constant feeling of being hunted. Now, the entire city was in shock. But he knew there was still much more to be revealed. Because if a simple van hid so many secrets, what else could be behind that network? And the answer to that question was about to emerge from a police operation that would not only confirm their suspicions, but also expose an even more disturbing truth, capable of leaving everyone speechless. With the evidence found in the van, the investigation reached unprecedented proportions. The local police alone couldn't handle the gravity of the case. Then, federal agents from the FBI joined the operation, bringing with them sophisticated equipment, unmarked cars, and helicopters prepared for a nighttime operation. The entire neighborhood seemed to live in suspense, as if awaiting the outcome of a horror film that had suddenly become reality. Jamal, from afar, watched the movement with his heart racing. Even though he was just a child, he knew that each discovery was the result of his insistence on remaining silent. Now, the entire city was mobilized because he had seen what others refused to see. But at the same time, he felt the weight of that responsibility on shoulders too young to bear. The operation began after tracking phone signals and security cameras. Investigators discovered that the van always led to the same location, an abandoned warehouse in the city's industrial zone. The footage showed suspicious activity, especially at night. With this evidence, there was no more time to waste. Armed police silently surrounded the area, while undercover agents cautiously approached the building. It was at that moment that the rescue happened. Amidst the darkness, with flashlights illuminating every corner, they found the unimaginable. Several children held captive, some visibly frail, others so frightened they could barely speak. Chains, dirty mattresses, and food scraps scattered across the floor completed the horrific scene. Officers immediately called ambulances, and paramedics rushed to provide assistance. The children's cries echoed, mixed with the firm voices of the officers assuring them that they were now safe. The images broadcast on television that morning etched themselves into the city's collective memory. People wept in front of their screens in disbelief that such a cruel scheme had taken place so close to their homes. Meanwhile, Jamal, protected by neighbors and family friends, felt a mixture of relief and anguish. Relief knowing lives had been saved, but anguish because he understood this was just the tip of the iceberg of something much larger. The van driver was not found at the scene, and this absence further fueled the feeling that the criminal network had not been completely dismantled. If there was one warehouse, how many others could there be? If so many children were found, how many were still missing? These questions lingered over everyone, but especially Jamal, who now had confirmation that his intuition was not only right, but had become fundamental in freeing so many lives. And it would be precisely this mixture of victory and uncertainty that would make room for something even more profound. The recognition he never sought, but which would arrive in an overwhelming way, bringing tears, apologies, and an emotional weight impossible to ignore. The days following the rescue were filled with emotion throughout the city. Headlines splashed the story in bold letters. News programs devoted hours to covering every detail. And for the first time, Jamal's name was mentioned, not as the shy schoolboy, but as the one who had the courage to face alone a danger that adults chose to ignore. Still, for him, the sudden fame didn't mean victory, but rather a painful reminder that if only they had believed sooner, many children could have been saved sooner. At school, the atmosphere changed drastically. Classmates who had previously laughed at his words now regarded him with respect, some even ashamed of having mocked him. The teacher, embarrassed for having downplayed his warnings, apologized in front of the class. Her words were simple but weighty. She acknowledged that she had failed to listen, that she had let slip a cry for help disguised as a childish tale. Jamal listened silently, without rancor, simply with the serenity of someone who understood that in that moment, it was no longer about apologies, but about learning. In the community, neighbors approached to congratulate the mother, calling Jamal a hero. Tears welling in her eyes, she held her son's hand and simply said, "He always tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I should have trusted him." It was a mixture of pride and regret, because the belated recognition was accompanied by the knowledge that the pain could have been avoided. The most memorable moment came at a ceremony organized by the local police, where Jamal received a certificate of bravery. Police officers, officials, and journalists were present, but what truly touched the boy's heart was the speech given by one of the officers who had participated in the rescue. In a firm voice, he declared, "It was thanks to this boy that lives were saved. He saw what we all ignored." The words echoed like a weight, lifted from his shoulders. For the first time, Jamal felt he was no longer alone. Despite all the accolades, he wasn't seeking medals, prizes, or headlines. What he truly wished for was simple, that someone had believed in him sooner, that his voice, so small in the noise of the adult world, had been heard without disdain. This thought silently followed him, like an invisible scar that wouldn't easily fade. But as much as the belated recognition brought some relief, Jamal knew the story wasn't completely over yet. The van driver was still at large, and this left the feeling that darkness still lurked around the city's corners. And it would be precisely this emptiness, this absence of definitive closure, that would accompany Jamal back to his routine. Because, even surrounded by applause and apologies, there was something in the air that whispered that this wasn't the last time he would feel danger approaching. The following weeks returned the town to a semblance of normalcy, but for Jamal, nothing felt quite the same. Walking to school was no longer just a monotonous routine, but a journey, filled with memories that insisted on returning. Every corner, every parked car, every strange look from an anonymous adult carried a silent weight, as if the world around him had revealed a dark layer he couldn't see before. Even so, he pressed on, clutching his backpack tightly and keeping his eyes open, because he understood that surveillance was now part of who he was. At home, the mother and sister's routine was trying to return to normal, but there was a new atmosphere between them. The mother, previously always rushed and exhausted, began to set aside extra minutes to listen to her son, finally understanding that his voice had value, that a child's intuition could carry truths that adults often don't want to face. This strengthened bond was a comfort, but it didn't erase the memories of sleepless nights, nor the weight of the unanswered questions that still lingered in the air. At school, Jamal resumed his discreet place, sitting in the back of the classroom, observing more than speaking. But the looks were different now. There was respect, admiration, even a silent reverence. Maya, always by his side, became even more protective, as if she had understood that her shy friend was capable of facing invisible monsters when everyone else closed their eyes. Together, they walked side by side, sharing not only their childhood friendship, but the burden of having been so close to danger. One afternoon, on his way home, Jamal paused for a moment at his bedroom window, watching the street. The movement seemed ordinary: cars passing, children playing in the distance, neighbors chatting on the sidewalk. But as he fixed his eyes on a vehicle parked on the corner, a dark car with tinted windows, he felt that familiar chill again. The engine was off, but there was something about its presence that seemed out of place in the landscape. Jamal stood still for a few seconds, staring in silence until the car started and slowly disappeared down the avenue. He took a deep breath, as if understanding that danger never completely disappears, only changes form and location. In that moment, he understood that his story didn't end there. It was just the first chapter in a life marked by early courage, sharp intuition, and the burden of carrying on his shoulders the responsibility of having seen what many chose to ignore. Looking out the window, he reflected on how much the city had changed, how much he himself had changed, and how a simple act could transform not only the fate of a friend, but of an entire community. He was just a boy, but he had changed the destiny of an entire city. And if you've made it this far, don't let this story end on screen. Subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share this video so more people can learn about the courage of children like Jamal, who can change the world. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing you real, moving stories that can open our eyes.